Hello, BookTube. Well, it's the end of October, and therefore it's the end of Sherlocktober, our read-along of a great swath of terrific Sherlock Holmes short stories and one standout novel. And we finish up today with 6 more stories. These are 6 stories from the return of Sherlock Holmes. The first one being The Adventure of the Empty House, then The Adventure of the Norwood Builder, then the Adventure of the Dancing Men, then The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist, then The Adventure of the Abbey Grange, and then finally The Adventure of the Second Stain. And of course, if you've read these stories, you know how things start out. With the Adventure of the Empty House, we have a solitary and hollowed out Dr. John Watson, who's living in London without his friend Sherlock Holmes, who he believes has been dead for quite some time. Watson follows the news and notices that the death of the Honorable Geoffrey Adair, who was found dead in his room with a door locked. And the case has features of interest, as Holmes would have put it. And Watson can't help but think about it in that way, thinking what a loss it was to the world and to the city of London when Sherlock Holmes died. Because suddenly these mysterious figures, these mysterious crimes that the police are baffled by, have no one to solve them. And Watson is at an inquest, and he's following this news, and he's paying attention, and he's distracted and bumps into an old man who's peddling used books. And apologizes and thinks nothing of it. And then the old man follows him to his practice, follows him to his office, and prattles away about used books. And at one point mentions that he has several volumes that would look really good on that little shelf behind you that has an empty space. And that naturally causes Watson just casually to turn around and look at those shelves. And when he turns back, Sherlock Holmes is standing before him, alive, in perfect health. Sherlock Holmes had been disguised as that beggar. And Watson faints. Faints dead away. Has to wake up to the taste of brandy on his lips. And to Holmes apologizing for being so melodramatic. And Watson immediately wants to know how you came alive out of that awful abyss. And Holmes tells him it's because I was never in it. The classic grabbed onto a branch scenario that later pastiche writers point out, if it works for Sherlock Holmes, it might work for Professor Moriarty as well. But one way or another, in this book, in this short story, the story that Holmes tells is that he saves himself at the last minute. Moriarty plunges to his death, but Holmes is alive. But Holmes immediately realizes, as he's crawling his way up this water-soaked brick crevasse, he immediately realizes that everyone else thinks he's dead, and that it would serve him well to keep it that way, because there are several people, lieutenants of Professor Moriarty, who will be flushed into greater confidence, carelessness, if they think their great adversary is dead. And one of those people is Colonel Sebastian Moran, a crack shot and the second most dangerous man in Europe, who, it turns out in the course of The Adventure of the Empty House, is deeply involved in the death of Adair. And it seems like, just like that, the old magic is back, and Holmes and Watson are a team again. In fact, Watson comments on that. And you would never know, I don't think, from reading this story, if you didn't know the story, about how long Arthur Conan Doyle had waited to bring this character back, and how reluctantly he brought him back. I don't think you'd ever be able to guess it. That is one of the writing feats in The Adventure of the Empty House that I think is often uncommented upon, is how seamless it is. And yet, in the course of these 6 stories, I'm curious to know what you think, but in the course of these 6 stories, I think it's clear that we are dealing with a writer who, despite trying to write like his former self, has undergone a maturation, or at least a change in his writing set. There's far more dialogue, I think, in these stories, but also far more description. And a polarity between the two that leaves almost nothing in between. It's, to me, the 6 stories that we're reading today read very differently in a lot of ways. At a lot of times, in every story, there are several moments that read very differently from the last batch of short stories that we read, which, makes sense in a way, because that last batch of these stories are separated by a decade. But nevertheless, I'll be curious to know if you, especially those of you who are reading these for the first time, I'd be curious to know if you encountered that change, if you felt like this author has shifted his game just a bit. But we have the stories here ranged. They are the one thing that definitely has not changed is Doyle's skill with outlandish plots. Like, for instance, The Adventure of the Dancing Men, which has a story with pictograms. There are pictograms all throughout. Someone has devised a code language of dancing men with signal flags. And it's impenetrable, of course, or at least it seems that way. And when the little slips of paper that have these various messages on them are brought before Holmes by someone seeking his help, Holmes patiently, calmly hears the person out, and then when they go, we get this passage here. Sherlock Holmes preserved his calm, professional manner until our visitor had left us, although it was easy for me, who knew him so well, to see that he was profoundly excited. The moment that Hilton Cubit's broad back had disappeared through the door, my comrade rushed to the table, laid out all the slips of paper containing dancing men in front of him, and threw himself into an intricate and elaborate calculation. For 2 hours I watched him as he covered sheet after sheet of paper with figures and letters, so completely absorbed in his task that he had evidently forgotten my presence. Sometimes he was making progress and whistled and sang as he worked. Sometimes he was puzzled and would sit for long spells with furrowed brow and a vacant eye. Finally he sprang from his chair with a cry of satisfaction and walked up and down the room, rubbing his hands together. Then he wrote a long telegram upon a cable form. If my answer to this is as I hope, you'll have very pretty case to add to your collection, Watson. And even in that passage, which, we've seen before, in previous short story collections, we've seen Holmes throw himself upon the ground, throw himself upon a carpet, abandon himself to that very center of his existence. That moment is the center of Holmes's existence, encountering a truly outlandish problem and mastering it through sheer thinking, through sheer perseverance. We encounter that moment in earlier stories many times, but I even in that, I detect, maybe it's just that I've read these stories too many times, I detect a different cadence, a better cadence, more grand, less schlocky. But anyway, we move on from there. There's also some wonderful scenes of high drama. There's a story in which a man kidnaps a woman in order to force her to marry him. And a little unbeknownst to him, Holmes and Watson and her previous fiancé are hot on his heels. They encounter him, with this disgraceful, disheveled hedge priest who's managed to do the deed even though he knows it's totally against the canon. It's totally a fraudulent marriage. The woman is clearly not willing. But he does it anyway. And our heroes encounter him seemingly too late. And the man, the villain of the piece, says, "You're too late. She's now my wife." And the former fiancé says, "No, she's now your widow," and shoots him right then. That is a fantastic back and forth of dialogue, and we get a lot of that here. One of the things I noticed in these stories, reading them again for this read-along, is that a lot of those great exchanges happened between Holmes and other people, not Watson. And a lot of secondary characters are also given great dialogue, great turns of expression. Hello. Hello there, baby. How's the baby? Oh. Do you want to see your fans? Huh? They want to see you. Here, up we go. Oh. Oh. There they are. Yes. Oh. Oh. But anyway, by the time these short stories are over, including the last one that we get, the last one paints us a slightly somber picture. Watson says that he has given up writing these cases because Holmes wants him to give up. Holmes wants him to stop writing the cases because Holmes is now retired. He's a beekeeper in Sussex. He's not. There's a fundamental change has worked in what had been a fairly static relationship. The stories are over. And they're over not in the way that they were, that we saw in the final problem where Holmes and Moriarty fall into the abyss, grappled in each other's arms. Instead, they're ended in a way that doesn't really admit of being brought back. If you kill a young character in a dramatic way, you can bring that character back. But if you have that character retire, change professions, decide to give up the hurly-burly of London's crime world to go down into the countryside, there isn't really any coming back from that. I mean, famously, of course, there have been 80 million pastiche stories about Holmes in retirement, Holmes solving problems, that sort of thing. The most famous ones being by Mary Russell, where Sherlock Holmes not only begins solving crimes in his 7th and 8th decade, but also marries, falls in love and marries. And those are good novels. I don't think that the characterization of Sherlock Holmes in those stories is particularly strong, but I don't think it's meant to be. I don't think he's meant to be the main character. But other pastiche novelists have gone to town on that particular Holmes. There was also a wonderful movie, relatively set thereabouts along that template. But for our purposes, for Sherlocktober, for reading the canon here until we do this next year, that's in a way a more dramatic and a sadder ending than the ending at the end of the final problem. Sherlock Holmes doesn't die, he walks away. He walks away from this profession that he created for himself. And all those characters, Mycroft Holmes and Inspector Lestrade and Professor Moriarty and Irene Adler, and all of that is left behind. All the scenarios that we have seen in earlier stories, even in this read-along, where Holmes is desperate for stimulation, apparently that's all over. Apparently he decides to give it up. I find that fascinating. I am more and more depressed by that last story every time I reread it, including this time. So I'll be curious to know what you made of that change. That is the way the Sherlock Holmes stories really end. They end with Holmes deciding to quit, which seems really strange. So that brings us to the end of Sherlocktober. We've filled the month of October with Sherlock Holmes, with Arthur Conan Doyle goodness. And we'll do this again next year. We'll do Sherlocktober next year and deal with more short stories, a different novel, maybe some pastiche fiction. That'd be fun. There's an infinite variety. There are infinite possibilities when it comes to Sherlock Holmes. But in the meantime, before we do that, I want to hear all about not only these 6 stories, but also your general impressions of Sherlock Holmes for the whole month, especially those of you who are encountering him for the first time. I mean, you're not. It's not possible to encounter Holmes for the first time, but it's plenty possible to read the actual stories for the first time. And those of you who are, I'm wondering if you're finding them surprising. I tried to give, in this month, a big, broad spectrum of the different kinds of things that Doyle can do in a Sherlock Holmes short story or novel. And I'm wondering what your impressions are now that we're done. We're finished with Sherlock Holmes for this year. We have a read-along coming up in November, but it's not lighthearted short stories. Okay? 1 week from today, we are reading the first 30 chapters of Herman Melville's Moby Dick. No small undertaking, but we have a lot to talk about. It is fascinating, and it's high time. so that wraps up Sherlocktober. Tell me all about it, and gird yourself for next weekend. I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.